Hi, welcome to Cloud Cover. My name is Ryan Dunn.
And I'm Steve Marks.
The show this week, we have one of our returning guests, the infamous Wade Wegner.
Thank you.
He's going to be covering the caching service in, well, we call it the AppFabric, Windows Azure AppFabric, I suppose. So we'll just stick with
Windows
that.
Azure AppFabric.
AppFabric.
Wonderful.
It's a long name. So the official name will be Windows Azure AppFabric Caching Service.
Service?
Windows Azure AppFabric caching.
No
Okay,
service.
just caching,
No
no
service.
service. Okay.
It's no shirt, no shoes.
Okay,
No service.
so we will eventually get to that, but first, as always, we will cover the news.
Yes. Let's start off with this post on the Windows Azure blog. It's actually really just a pointer to a white paper written by David Chappell called the Windows Azure Programming Model. And it really explains what scale out means in Windows Azure, what the implications of that are, what it means to you as a developer in thinking through that programming model to get sort of high availability, high scalability, et cetera. I think it even talks about VM role and how that fits into the puzzle.
Yeah.
So recommend that white paper if you want to get kind of the theoretical background on sort of why the programming model is the way it is.
And just as an aside, David Chappell is incredibly funny.
Chappelle, yeah.
I love his show.
Different guy, actually.
Oh.
Little known fact.
Not the same
This
guy.
is David Chappell,
Not David Chappelle.
not Dave Chappelle.
Yeah, well, either way.
Different person. White papers by both are good.
Yeah. If you
find a
it
white paper by Dave Chappelle, also read that.
Yes.
Okay. Next is a breaking change. We just wanted to highlight this. This has probably already happened. I think that Guest OS 1.8 is already out to pretty much everybody, and so
Mostly.
So all we're telling you is why stuff broke if it already broke for you. But
not everybody would hit this. It's just a kind of
absolutely.
depends.
And we actually did some before putting this out. We actually did some of the research on kind of how many people were using different features and whatever. And so right, it doesn't affect everybody. It's actually the change is actually a good thing, but it has this kind of surprising implication.
Well, let's explain it.
Basically, what happens is that if you're using the drive, you use a local cache, and you initialize that cache, and then you go sort of fill it up with the actual cache for your drive as you're using it.
Exactly.
The change is that when you initialize that cache, we're going to actually allocate everything right away. So we're going to allocate a cache of that size immediately.
We were doing it lazily before.
Yeah, before it was just sort of all right, and then we just sort of fill up as we go.
Right.
So now, if you try to specify a cache size that's bigger than the actual free disk space,
right,
it'll just fail right off the bat instead of actually working for a while because it just fills up that cache gradually. What's difficult about this is that there's also this weird thing that goes on with how local storage resources are allocated. So if you say in your, and this is actually just a bug, if you say in your, I consider it a bug anyway, if you say in your service definition file that you want 1,000 megabytes, you'll get like 980. So it's actually, there's some space that's taken up for some other things. So you don't actually get exactly what's specified there. So that means if you say, I want a local resource, local storage resource of this size, and then you say, I want to use a cache of that exact size, that's actually too big. And so the thing that you need to do is basically just make the local resource about 20 megabytes to be safe, larger than what you're actually going to use. So this formats really poorly, by the way. I didn't notice before, but what you can't see here is it says size in MB equals 1020. And then we use just 1,000 when we call drive.mal.
Do a view source and we can see it. Not right now,
but you can do that. Also, this is also on the Windows Azure storage blog, and it may be formatted differently.
And your RSS reader will actually pick this up just fine.
Yeah, that's why I didn't notice, because I saw this in my feed reader. And Okay, so anyway, so that's something to be aware of. If you're using drives as you go to Guest OS 1.8 and beyond, you have to be aware of this. We're probably going to fix the way that resource allocation works. So at some point, when you say size in MB equals 1,000, you actually get the full 1,000. At which point you probably won't care.
I would
about
actually
this,
never say 1,000. I'd probably do 1,024.
Okay. You always use powers of 2.
Yeah.
Just for.
It's just
we thought about having
me.
a logarithmic scale there. We thought about saying, power of 2 megabytes.
I mean, it's like Western Digital and Seagate when they rip you off with like 300 gigabyte drive. It's not really.
All right. Let's go on to my favorite bug, because I found this bug.
That's your favorite?
That's why it's my favorite, because I found it.
Did you get any reward or a bounty for this?
I got to help them write a blog post about it.
I'm not sure. Not even like an Applebee's coupon?
No, there wasn't even an Applebee's coupon. If you are downloading a blob to a local file by using cloudblob.download to file. It basically, the implementation of it looks pretty much like this. This is a correct, good way to do it, except it says file.openWrite instead of file.create, and that was just a bug on our part. That means that if there's an existing file, it'll just start writing at the beginning of the file without deleting the existing content.
And so if you had a longer one, it would.
If you had a long file and you downloaded a short blob into it, it'll leave this sort of crud behind.
So you found that out by downloading these movies.
This is the
you were
exact
looking
sample.
At, you got mail.
Movies to watch.txt.
Yeah.
That I keep this on my desktop
And
at all times.
Sleepless in Seattle and Notting Hill. That's awesome, Steve.
So when I sent the storage team this bug, I sent them an example of, I sent them source code and the output and whatever, and it had, this is some very long text and this is shorter text. And this is what they came up with for the blog, movies to watch.txt. Anyway, this was actually, remember when we did an episode on executables in a worker role.
Yeah.
And I had some blob syncing thing.
3 or 4 times. But
we've shown similar things, but this one in particular, I had this blob sync thing that pulled blobs, and it used cloudblob.download to file.
Right.
Which meant that it was buggy if you changed the executable in that worker to be something with a smaller byte size.
Right.
It would actually break. It would copy that over, end up with some totally invalid executable.
So the workaround here is always use a larger blob.
Yeah. Make sure your blobs are
always
monotonically increasing in size.
And never go smaller.
No, the workaround is to just do these 3 lines.
Okay.
File.create and then download the stream on that. And that's what the fix will be once we get a fix for this in the storage client library. It'll probably be exactly this. It'll probably just do this.
Okay.
Okay, anyway, that was a really long story for a pretty simple bug.
This one. I know this one. So I get to talk about this one.
Go for it.
All right, fine.
Please do.
So we just released out on Code Gallery. I say we, it's mostly David Aiken. You might remember David Aiken.
Yeah, he's
Seen
that
that
one
guy?
who didn't write those PowerShell scripts for us for like 8 weeks.
Yeah, it was like a month and a half at least.
Yeah.
And then, so David was actually on show number 2.
He was. He
So you can
replaced
see
me when
who
I
he
was in
is.
Japan.
He, I believe he's Scottish or Welsh, one of the two. But a good guy, friend of the show. He worked on and kind of managed this diagnostic monitor project. And essentially what this is we've taken some capabilities to aggregate diagnostic information that you generally collect with the diagnostic API. So you know how you collect performance counters, event logs, and all those kind of things, and queue count and other things. And we wrote a general purpose kind of aggregation system where we will take, you know, daily averages, weekly averages, depending on the range, and we kind of add to that model. And then on top of it, we've layered basically a self-hosted website that you can drop into a role. Now, the end goal here is that we'll move this probably into the role plugin model that you have for things coming in the new SDK here shortly for like how we do remote access and things like that. But what will happen is you'll be able to include that, and it will essentially by going out to your service in a different port, it'll fire up this website. It'll have all this information. And you'll be able to monitor your service as well. Very cool project. Right now, it's in the prototype phase, as we're calling it, because there's a few steps you need to do. A few files have to go into a certain location in blob storage and that kind of stuff. So it's not as drop dead simple as we'd like to make it, but we will get there here shortly. I was lucky enough to demo this at TechEd Europe.
Oh, great.
Which is why we didn't have the show last week, by the way.
Everybody was there except me.
I know. I was expecting a show and you didn't do it.
Yeah.
Which, by the way, if you attended any of my talks at TechEd Europe, I was sick. I just want to point out I lost my voice. I was sick. I'm still recovering my voice. Someone left an actual comment to me that said, "I can't believe."
Speak louder.
No, well that too. Someone like misunderstood the joke I said and said like. Hey, you know, it wasn't very professional you to go out drinking the night before and lose your voice. I was like, where did that come from?
Oh, that's what you said.
I was joking. I said, I wish I had a good story for you, like I was at a Justin Bieber concert and I lost my voice, but no, it's just I'm sick and something to that effect. And somehow that got translated in Europe, and Ryan was out drinking last night and lost his voice.
Okay.
That was not the case.
So you heard it here first. Ryan was out drinking, lost his voice, showed this at TechEd.
I was out drinking at a Justin Bieber. Actually, it was David Hasselhoff concert.
Yeah.
And then lost my voice.
He's big there.
Okay.
Right. So anyway, I like it because it has pretty graphs.
It is really awesome.
The summary of this is it makes pretty graphs out of your diagnostics data, which is
all
awesome.
your diagnostics. It rolls it up. There's a lot of features in here. So take a look at it.
Okay, next up is Windows Phone 7 sample app README. I don't think README is actually part of what this thing's called.
The news here is that we released a README
Yes.
on Windows Phone 7 sample.
Yep, it's called readme.txt.
Yeah, and very important, so take a look on it.
This is basically a sample around how to use ACS, access control, from Windows Phone 7 Silverlight application.
Yeah, a lot of people want to do that, right? Because you have the Gmail, Facebook, Windows Live ID integration, the ACS. And wouldn't it be super sweet if you could use your phone and get that same level of integration?
Yes, it would, Ryan, and that's
so
way we made this README.
There is a README that says, wouldn't it be sweet if you could do that?
Yeah, that's the content of the README.
Yeah. Check it out if you want to see how it's done. This is pretty neat sample.
The pictures aren't as pretty as the previous news item.
They must have taken it from the emulator.
They're a little bit fuzzy, though. Yeah. I'm disappointed with the lack of focus.
Maybe they did it on purpose because they didn't want you to see what their data was.
Maybe.
We should probably close that.
Let's close Outlook. Okay.
All right, here we go. And lastly,
last up,
caching CTP. There's a nice interview.
This is Wade Wagner.
Yep. Wade did a nice interview with Karan.
Yep. That's actually Karan.
Yep.
Yeah. And well, go ahead, explain it, Wade. I don't need to. You're here.
Karan's the GPM for the caching service.
Yep.
And yeah, so we talked about the caching service, some of the scenarios and so forth, and many of the things we'll talk about today as well. So
great.
Great. So if you don't want to watch the rest of the show, you can just skip
watch
it
this.
and watch this video instead.
And Wade's still talking in it.
And yeah, either way though, you do have to listen to Wade.
Yep.
But that's appropriate because Wade is the guy who I like to listen to about this stuff because he knows what he's talking about.
All right.
With that, here's Wade.
Wade, we're here to talk about caching.
Well,
yeah.
Thanks for having me back.
Yep.
I really enjoyed the last time I was on the show.
Yeah, we were.
It was a good time.
It was good.
We had fun with Wade last time.
Yeah. So just to show my appreciation, I actually decided to set something up for you guys as well.
Oh.
So here, let me show you.
Okay.
Go to Steve's Funky Fresh Beat.
It was very good.
That was good, and it was well deserved. But
yeah.
I don't think we can actually put that on the show. So if you can cut
that out.
that previous part. But thank you,
Wade.
Well, thank you guys.
I will remember that always.
Okay, let's go through the caching.
So what's caching all about? It's not a service, I heard, because it's not called the Windows Azure AppFabric Caching Service.
Yeah, so at PDC, we announced a new service as part of Windows Azure AppFabric.
Service, yeah.
So it is a service, absolutely. Yeah. And it's the caching service. So many of you have probably heard of Velocity, codename Velocity, which is part of Windows Server AppFabric caching. And what we've done is we've taken those bits that code based and made it available as a service. So if you are building an application running in Windows Azure, you can consume this caching service and leverage it for a number of different things. So specifically, there's some really good use cases for the caching service, and we'll jump into code later and walk through them. But to enumerate them real quickly is session state. So a session state provider and storing your session state in the caching service.
It's a distributed cache, right?
Yeah, so I was going to get to that in a minute, but yeah, absolutely.
Okay,
so it's okay. It's okay. So
silence, Ryan.
Continue. It is. It's an in-memory distributed cache.
Okay.
So we'll come right back to it. So so the caching using caching for a session state provider, reference data. So it could be catalog information, things that don't change very often that you could put into the cache. And then there's also a page output cache as well. So an ASP.NET page output cache. So you can leverage the caching service for your page output caching.
Awesome.
So yeah, so some good use cases. But yeah, so getting back to the caching service, it is an in-memory distributed cache. So what that means is it's in memory, so it leverages memory within the machine, so very, very fast I/O. So you can do gets and puts and stuff very, very quickly to get things in and out. And then it's distributed, so when you're interacting with the cache, it's actually distributed across multiple instances. So provides you some not durability in the sense that you put long-lived information in there, but it's going to protect you from hardware failures and so forth. So your information in that cache will be distributed across multiple
everything's
hosts.
stored multiple times in RAM, just on different machines, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And so part of the reason for that as well is we want, not only does this need to be fast, but we also want to make it easy to scale. So if you have an application that isn't always getting a lot of hits, maybe you're not using the cache very much at a point in time, you can easily scale it to support, to make it larger, just make it smaller, and so forth. And by having that distributed across multiple machines, it makes it easier to actually handle the scaling aspects of it as well. So, might actually be easier if we move over to the whiteboard, and then we can talk through some of the finer points of the caching service.
Sounds good.
All right, so when talking about the caching service, one of the things that I find to be helpful to do is to talk about the different types of latency that you might experience when storing data. Whether you're storing it in a database, a backend data store, or you're storing it within some kind of in-memory cache. And so I actually got this from Karan. If you watch the interview, you'll see him walk through this as well. But it's nice to kind of demonstrate this in a pyramid. So we'll kind of talk through a latency pyramid where we highlight the fact that some of the slowest I/O you can get is whenever you have to write to disk, right? So anytime that you're writing back to disk, could be a database, it could be some sort of storage service, you're going to experience the highest I/O in that point. So it's going to be really, really high I/O. If you have data that is particularly hot, maybe it's the hottest items if you're selling some kind of product, or if it's just stuff that you need to pull pretty frequently, storing it to disk is going to be a pretty expensive operation.
And it's probably worth pointing out that if you're using Windows Azure Storage or SQL Azure, there is a disk involved, and everything is actually written on a disk at some point. So you're in that bucket of sort of the highest I/O if you're using the storage that we provide.
Yep, absolutely. Now, when you start looking at the caching service, anytime you call out to the caching service, you're going to be going across a network, right? So there's network latency as well. So in this case, we'll highlight it here. Now, network latency typically is going to be as expensive as disk, right? So you can go across the network, especially like in our data centers. It's optimized. We have fat pipes. Everything is pretty quick. But this would be an example of using the Windows Azure AppFabric caching service. When you're calling out to it, you are going to be experiencing some network latency, right? So if I deploy my application into Windows Azure, it's running in a web role, and I'm calling to the caching service, it's going to be going across the network. So we can end up saying, AppFabric caching falls into, this bucket as well, right? And I'm just dropping the Windows Azure part just to be able to fit it here. So it is Windows Azure AppFabric caching, right? And so there's going to be some network latency. Now, at the very top, the fastest is going to be just straight, storing things in memory, not having to go across the wire at all. And so one of the nice things about AppFabric caching is you have this concept called the local cache. And so what it means is you can store something in memory on the client, so that if you need to access it and you don't want to go across the wire, you can store it within the client. So there's a mode called local cache within AppFabric caching in which you can leverage the memory on the client. So what that means is you may have a series of web servers that are talking to this caching service. If there's some data that you just want to make available for very, very fast reads, you can store it in that local cache. And it'll actually use some of the physical memory within the web role. So that's going to still be AppFabric caching, but it's going to be the local cache. So AppFabric caching, local cache.
So is that cache synchronized across all your running instances?
No, it's not. So what you'd end up doing is loading it into the local cache within the instances. So there's no synchronization across the instances.
And it just falls back to AppFabric. Right?
Exactly.
This is basically
if it
an optimization. Right.
Yep.
If it happens to be in my local memory, great. If it's not, I'll go across the network to sort of the remote cache. Don't erase the wizard hat. I loved it. And then bring it back, and then I'll sort of, as I read it, I'll put it in the local cache.
So it's probably good to now it's going to be hard for me to draw this, but let's say here we've got an application, right? So here's the load balancer, traffic's coming in, and we've got our web tier right here, right? Now with the web tier, we might be calling out to the distributed cache, so this would be AppFabric caching, and then maybe there's calls out to database as well. Now I don't put the cache in front of or between because you're not always going to want to go to the cache, right? Not everything that you call out from, let's say, SQL Azure, you're going to stick into the cache. So there's going to be some times where you're calling and talking directly to the database. There's other times where you're going to talk to the cache. And so this optimization local cache, what that means is this web application here, let's say it makes a call into SQL Azure and gets some data, and then it's going to store that into the cache so that the next time this guy can just check the the caching service, and it can grab that data right out without having to go to SQL Azure. Now, when it does that, it has the ability to put it into, into a chunk right here, right? So you can leverage local cache, and you can store some of that information within the client, but you do it on a web role by web role basis. It wouldn't be synchronized across all the different web roles. So
to use the cache service, the caching service, I have to make an explicit. I mean, I'm making some explicit go fetch it and bring it back.
Exactly. Yep.
If I'm using the local memory cache, that's sort of implicit, right? In my, like, when I go reach into the cache, it'll first check the memory cache, and then, like, I don't have to do a step that handles the logic of do I have it locally or not.
What you'll actually do is when you set up your data cache factory, you can actually specify a configuration, and in that configuration, you'd specify whether or not you're using the local cache.
Okay.
So that when you go to do the get, it'll know where to check.
So no code change, so it's just a config change.
It's a change. Now you can do it via config, so you can do it like in an app config or web config file, or you could end up doing it in code as well. So you could, when you create the data cache factory, when you create the data cache factory, you can.
So how does invalidation handled in this scenario? If everybody has a local cache, how are we getting invalidation? Is the cache service check the database? Or?
Yeah, so in Windows Server AppFabric caching, there's actually a notification service so that, let's say something in the data tier changes or you just want to invalidate and evict that data from the cache, you can do so. In the CTP of Windows Azure AppFabric caching, there is no notification service. So right now, things only get evicted by time spans, so things time out. So right now, when you specify, like use local cache, or even whenever you create and store data in the cache, you will specify how long it should live, so a TTL on it.
Okay, and is it a sliding, or is that an option? Because it used to be in ASP.NET, you remember it was like, oh, timeout after 1 hour, or timeout after just it hasn't been used in an hour.
Gotcha. No, you explicitly state how long it lives, and then it will get evicted.
Okay.
And then for the CTP as well, you have a certain size. You have a certain size cache available, and if you start filling that up, it's going to start evicting.
And it'll evict just the oldest data.
Exactly. Right. Yep. So.
Makes sense. Now, in this model right here, we've been talking about web roles and everything. Is the service available to anything?
Yes. So the caching service is actually a TCP endpoint, it's WCF service, running port 22233. And anything can call out to it. So, I mean, if you've got network connectivity, you can. So I'll show a demo in a moment where I'm actually calling out to the caching service from my laptop. Now, the problem there, and if you go back to the wizard hat, you're going to be crossing the network. So if you think about the fact that when you create it, you're going to be creating that caching service in one of our data centers, there's going to be quite a bit of network I/O and latency. So if you're going to do something local, like on-premises, you're better off using Windows Server AppFabric caching. And it's actually raises a good point because the API is the same. So whether you're programming against Windows Server AppFabric caching or Windows Azure AppFabric caching, your code is identical. So there is symmetry.
There's just a configuration saying that says, oh, instead of the endpoint, which happens to be locally on premises, it happens to be this cloud app.
Just the host endpoint that you specify. Yep.
Now, so I guess one of the questions it was in there, and I wasn't clear on whether or not we got to it, is can PHP applications use this service?
So right now it is a WCF endpoint. So if it's going to largely be
.NET only, right?
.NET only. Yep.
Okay.
Yeah.
So one of the things that the team is looking at is creating a REST endpoint for the caching service.
Okay.
So that would open up a lot of opportunities for interoperability with other technologies.
Okay. Python. I'll be in there with a Python client as soon as I have a REST endpoint.
You can use Python.NET or IronPython.
IronPython.
Yeah, that's
cheating.
It's not the language I'm after. It's the C Python.
Okay.
It's cheating. Yeah, if you just use WCF from
it's
your
cheating if
IronPython.
it works exactly the same. So did you have some demos?
Yeah. So why don't we show some of the demos?
Cool. Great.
All right, so to get started with the caching service, the first thing you should do is actually go to the AppFabric Labs portal. And so I'm assuming you guys will put this in show notes, but it's portal.appfabriclabs.com. And
don't assume stuff. He's making work for us and just like nothing. He didn't ask us first. Just said, oh yeah, you guys should put this link
I think you should put that in the show notes.
All right, fine.
So when you come into the AppFabric Labs portal, you'll either create a project, or in my case, you'll have a project already created. And so when you select it, you'll see that you have service namespaces. Now, when I was on here talking about the service bus, I gave some context around service namespace. Just think of the service namespace as being your slice of AppFabric. So the services you want to leverage within AppFabric, this is your slice of them. This is the way in which you interact
address them.
Yep, okay. Exactly. And so I've got some created here, but I'll go ahead and create a new service namespace.
It must take a really long time then.
It's actually pretty quick.
Okay.
So we'll do cloud cover. You guys haven't already created one yet, have you?
It's doubtful.
And so you didn't. And so you'll see it'll start activating, right? And one thing to note is through this service namespace, you can interact with Service Bus, ACS, and then also cache. So at PDC is when we introduced cache. So prior to that, there had been no cache.
Okay.
And it'll take a few minutes to activate. And once it's done, we'll go ahead and show you some of the
active there.
There we go. All right. So when you come into
that wasn't really that long.
Yeah. I mean, if you think about the fact that it just provisioned a cache for you, it's managed for you. You don't have to do anything. I mean, we have our own cache available already. It's actually pretty cool.
Is there an API for this? Can we, or do you have to use the portal?
Right now, you do have to use the portal.
Okay.
There is, by launch, there's full. There will be an API for for you to be able to do all this. So a couple of things just to highlight here. We talked about the fact that there's an endpoint that you communicate with, and that endpoint is actually this right here. So you see cloudcover.cache.appfabriclabs.com. So when I specify the host that I want to interact with, that's actually the endpoint. So it's addressable, I can hit it, and then also you can see how it's got a service port, so that's going to be communicating over TCP to 22233, and then it's got a token. Now, since the caching service is addressable and available on the internet, you actually present a token in the request header, so that when I go to interact with the caching service, it presents the token so that it can authenticate me.
Is it ACS?
And it is an ACS token. So and
look at the level of integration.
Yeah, and if you want to, you can actually click on Manage Access Control for cache and take a look at how it's set up and configured. I won't do that on this show. The next thing to highlight is the fact that you get a lot of config information provided for you. So the idea here is that once you've got the SDK installed and set up, you really can just copy and paste and start working against the caching service. If you want to grab the SDK, right now actually this link is wrong. This will point you to the V1 download. You actually come here to Help and Resources, and you can grab the SDK. And I assume also you guys will put that in your show notes, right? So,
well, you tell us to.
But that's it. One more. You get one more link.
Yeah.
That's it.
So real quick, let's go ahead and use this. So what I've got is just a starting point. So this is actually an application that's provided as part of the Windows Azure Platform Training Kit. We use it a couple of places, and it's just it's an MVC Azure store. So the idea here is that we've got this little application here. It calls out to SQL Azure, grabs product information. I can add it to the cart. I can do a checkout. Now, when I add it to the cart, it's actually using session state. So it's going to add that item to the session state, and it's using inproc. So it's just storing it in memory on the web client.
Right, which means it will not work when you scale it out in the cloud with the load balancer.
Yes.
Just always like to take the moment to point out that anything inproc is only on one of those machines.
Well, we're gonna fix that.
Exactly. That's why we have the cache.
Let's fix that. So first thing,
we have the cache.
Just grab this information. So I'll go through what this is when I get it. It'll be a little more legible when we get it into the web.doc config.
And to clarify, there's no caching stuff in this app as it stands now, right?
Correct. Yeah.
So right now, this is
absolutely.
This is any app.
Yep. No caching
line
whatsoever.
of code. No reference to an assembly. I mean, are we that pristine that we?
Yep.
Okay.
No, I haven't. We don't even have the references yet. So
good. So we're gonna see everything.
Yep. So
I like that.
What I've done here is we've got the config section. So this essentially adds a reference to the assembly that we'll leverage. And then data cache client section. So what this does is this actually specifies some of the metadata about the caching service.
Sure.
So you can see here we've got our cloudcover.cache.fabric.labs. Here's the port. And then here is the token, right? So it embeds that token into it. Now, this should be very similar to anyone that's used Windows Server AppFabric caching. The only difference is the mode message. So this mode is actually a new mode that was added to the API so that you could actually embed a token. Right. And the design and the intent here is for it to be extensible as well. So today, there's only support for ACS, but moving forward, this is an extensible model where you might be able to embed a different kind of token or something else. So
a hard-coded password, for instance.
Fabulous.
Security best practices.
That's what
So we've got that
At least
config
8
information.
characters.
Yeah.
We've got the config information. Let's go ahead and add the references. Now, one thing within the Windows Server AppFabric caching, the assemblies are GAC'd. And with the SDK for the Windows Azure AppFabric caching, it's just going to be in the directory that it's installed.
Okay.
So there is a little bit of a difference there. So it'll be under Program Files, Windows Azure AppFabric caching, v2, assemblies, cache, and there we got our assemblies.
Did you take them all?
Yep, I just grab. You grab them all. The one thing I will highlight is the Microsoft.web distributed cache. That's actually going to have the session state provider that we're going to leverage.
Oh, okay.
So that's what we're going to leverage in order to extend and create a custom session state provider.
Okay.
So we'll grab all these guys. And then the last thing, so we've added a reference to our caching service now. Now let's actually grab that session state provider. And again, we can come back to the portal, and it's all created for us. So we'll go ahead and grab that, and then come down to system.web, and we'll paste it in. And so you can see here, what it's doing is it's actually leveraging that Microsoft.web distributed cache, and it's creating a custom session state provider for it. So now, when we hit F5, and we run this app, when we add an item into the cart, it's actually going to, instead of using the session state in memory on the client, it's actually going to use the caching service.
Right, so we didn't change any code because
No code.
all we needed to do was, because the session provider is actually what's doing something.
Exactly.
Right, because normally you need some code that calls to the cache service or stores and retrieves something. But if you're using session state, there's just a built-in provider.
It's still
for
using
factory.
session, it's still adding to the session the same way it was before.
Right.
It's just now using a different provider for
But
it.
you can manually, call the API with puts. And,
So
and things like
we'll do that
right?
next, right? So right now we're using the session state provider. Obviously this data here is reference data. It's not going to be changing that much. So we can use the caching service now as an explicit cache, so that when we grab this data out of SQL Azure, rather than having to do that every time, we'll check the cache first. If it's not in cache, we'll grab it out of SQL Azure, and as soon as we grab it out, we'll put it into the cache.
Okay.
Right. So let's see. Let's go ahead and do that. So this MVC application, I actually have a products repository for everything. And so, gosh, I cannot work at this font size. So what I'm going to do is create a new...
Yeah, because this file is huge and full of lots of code. I can understand why it's hard.
Yeah. All right, so we're going to create a new constructor for products repository. So the next time when we create the products repository, what we're going to do is actually create a data cache factory. And that's part of the Microsoft.AppFabric, or application server.caching. And we'll end up creating that. Oh, actually, you know what? Here. Let's make that available elsewhere. If I can type. There we go.
It's hard to type at this font.
And create a new instance of that, right? So we've created the data cache factory. And the reason I have it in the constructor instead of it's not expensive, but it does take a little bit of time to create the data cache factory.
So you want to
so I don't want to do it every single time.
So on one of those,
exactly.
Right, yeah.
Yep.
And what's the factory itself? That's
okay. Yeah.
What is that object?
So the reason there's the factory is because you can do a number of things. You actually can pass in some configuration information, and it's going to be on the data cache factory configuration, where you can do things like specify the time to live, determine whether or not you want to leverage local cache, different things like that.
Okay.
Also, it's going to be through here that you manage things like notifications and so forth if you want to expire data and so forth. So it's a factory because there's actually quite a bit of things that you can do.
Okay. But this is the single entry point. If we create a data cache factory, basically all other things fall out of this.
Yep, absolutely.
Okay.
Yep.
That's good.
Good. So now what we'll actually want to do within our method here is create a data cache. And so the data cache is going to be created off of the data cache factory. And we're going to do a get default cache. Now, I do want to point out one thing with Windows Server AppFabric caching. You can create a data cache off of a named cache. So you can actually, kind of segment things based on different cache names. Within the caching service, you only ever use the get default cache. And the reason is because there's actually named caches behind the scenes, but the caching service will route and manage that for you based on metadata that's embedded within that ACS token. So when interacting with the APIs, we only use the get default cache. Okay. So we've grabbed that. The next thing we want to do is actually check to see, what is this thing that keeps popping up? All right. We want to check to see if that data is available in there, right? So what we want to do is say if let's say products equals data cache get products. as string. Right? So what it's doing is it's actually going to grab what's ever stored in our cache under the item name products, and it's going to load it into this this list of strings, right? So then now we can actually say if products is not null, we're going to just do a return, right? So at this point we can say, hey, that we grabbed the product information out of our cache, let's just go ahead and return it. Now, if it's not there, it's just going to keep walking through, right? Now it's going to use Entity Framework and actually call out to grab that.
Azure, right?
And then down here we can just end up saying data cache put, and we can end up saying put products.
Right, because that's the key we were using in the other place.
What's that? Yep.
Right, and then we just pass in our object. And we didn't have to do any serialization, right? We just pass in a .NET object.
Absolutely. Well, that's actually a couple of nice things about the caching service and this code base is you can put any .NET object into it, and then also there's no size limitations on it. So I think you guys have talked about memcache in the past, and there are some issues around the size, right? You can't put
right, and it's up to you to determine how to serialize and come back and whatever. And so this has some nicer .NET integration, which I think is something people will definitely appreciate.
So we'll go ahead and run this, and what we'll see is now the very first time, and I guess I could have put a breakpoint in there, but it's going to grab it from SQL Azure. And then when I do a refresh, now it's going to grab it from the cache. Now, to make it clear, one thing I'll point you to is we do have this running out on Windows Azure. And the reason I point you to this is a couple of things. I spent a little bit more time on there, so it's got some nice stuff that will surface up. The other thing is there's affinity between the app and the caching service. So if I turn on, so in this case, by default, we're just hitting SQL Azure. I can turn on the cache. And when I refresh, you're going to see the response times here are actually pretty good. It's pretty fast because there's affinity. It's just got some network latency, but very little. The last thing you can do is if you want to look at local cache. So again, local cache would be when you're pulling it into the memory on the web client. It's going to get extremely fast because it's right on the machine. 0 milliseconds. So
it takes no time at all.
No time at all.
It's instantaneous.
It's completely instantaneous.
Takes negative time.
Yeah.
So
happened before you clicked it.
So so
that's very cool.
Pretty easy. Session state provider, again, no code really. Just add the provider, and then to do explicit caching. Pretty simple as well.
All right. So I think at this point we probably want to get to our tip of the week, and really, well, let's get to the tip of the week first, and then we'll kind of tell people how to get started with this. I think is probably a good tip of the week.
Sounds great.
All right. So here it is. Your tip of the week.
Hardly had radio established itself the world over when television joined the battle for the airwaves. In living color.
Okay, great, Wade. So I'm interested in the caching service. Where do I go? How do I get started?
I want to use it, and I want it to be free.
So I can help you both. Yes. So I went through it quickly in the beginning, but portal.appfabriclabs.com is where to start.
Okay.
And so what this is?
What is the labs?
Yeah. So the labs is our CTP environment. So by CTP it is free, so there's no cost to it. But there's no SLAs as well. So there's no guarantee that we won't roll out an update. There's no guarantee that.
And there could be breaking changes.
There
still
could be
at this
breaking
point,
changes.
Right? Yeah.
Yep.
Okay.
So this is just a playground.
This is
absolutely
try out the new features.
So cache is here. If you go to the production AppFabric portal, you will not see cache because that's not rolled out into production yet. So use the labs. In fact, with access control, some of the updates that were released in September, that's also available through the labs environment. So that's important to use.
So this isn't just cache, right? Labs is for service bus, for access control, and for cache. They all have new features.
And there's some limitations in here, right, that are not going to be in what would be.
Yeah. So service bus specifically. So what the service bus team did here in this environment was they said we're going to start providing some new capabilities and some net new features within the service bus. And so they've rolled those out in the labs environment, but they have not rolled out the same features that are available within the production service today. And their intent is, as they march towards and have additional release dates, they'll be adding, the capabilities that you're familiar with into the labs environment, along with net new features as well. So, just as a plug, Clemens Vasters had a talk at PDC that was recorded that you can watch, in which he enumerates everything that's part of the labs.
Okay.
So.
Great. We're totally out of time, but I want to ask one final question, because otherwise people are going to just ask it in the comments. When the cache gets released, how much will it cost, and how will I pay for it? What can we tell people? I know we haven't said exactly what it is.
So there's no.
What's the one sentence?
So we don't have any pricing information right now. But what the team has done actually is created a survey in which they've wanted customers to provide feedback in terms of what should it cost.
I want it to be free.
Yeah, so you can provide that feedback, and so I'm assuming we can also add that to the show notes as well.
I totally had one more, so okay, we can do that too.
So,
okay,
excellent.
good. I just wanted to clear that up.
Well, thank you for coming back.
Thanks a
lot.
First
Thank
of
you
all.
guys,
and thanks for that surprise you gave to us.
That was very, very
memorable.
Yes.
If you want to interact with us, tell us on Twitter at Cloud Cover Show what you'd like to see, what your thoughts are.
And we know we've heard some requests. We'll get to those. It's a issue of scheduling people, and also kind of as things come up, prioritizing. So in some ways, we hear you. If you don't see your episode right away, don't worry, we're getting to it. But as Steve said, reach out to us on Twitter, email us, leave comments on these videos. And with that, I think we're done.
Till next time.
Thanks.